So that brings me to the last part of the presentation, which is probably the one that is most interesting to you, and that has to do with how do we foster a successful transition to a high quality of life in adulthood. And that's an ongoing question. I mean, we don't know the answer to that in a fundamental sense, but what I can tell you based on our 12 years of data collection is what's the nature of change in symptoms and behavior problems during adolescence and adulthood. Does that change differ from before to after the time a son or daughter leaves high school? What about changes in functional abilities in activities of daily living, which are those are the activities we need for maintaining our lifestyle on an everyday basis? What's our data in Wisconsin and Massachusetts on employment after high school and living arrangements in adulthood? And so I'll be sharing that with you now. And I think we have, I don't know in a population level the extent to which that applies to Orange County and to your economy here, but I offer this as an indication about the transition from the world of school to the world of adult life and work. So let's start with changes in autism symptoms and then behavior problems. This work is based on one of my former graduate students, Paul Shattuck, who began, while he was a graduate student, began our investigation of changes in autism symptoms over time. And we looked at that 4.5-year period between time 1 and time 4. And we asked whether autism symptoms changed during that period of time and what direction the change happened in. So we used the ADIR, which you may be familiar with, the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised, which is one of the gold standards for measuring autism symptoms. And we administered the ADIR at 6 points during the course of our study. And this analysis was conducted after the first 4 times. And we broke down the items in the ADIR into those subscales that you see there: nonverbal communication, verbal communication, social reciprocity, and repetitive behaviors and specialized interests, which of course are the sort of hallmarks of the diagnosis of autism. And here you see what the structure of that analysis looked like. We were looking at that 4.5-year period between time 1 and time 4. So I think this is good news. So what we see is that well, let me describe how we measured change. We measured change in standard deviation units, which for the non-statisticians in the room, a half a standard deviation is considered a clinically meaningful amount of change in a set of items in a measure. And so what you see in the red bars are clinically significant improvements in autism symptoms. The blue bar is stability, and the yellow bars are those individuals who declined by a clinically significant amount during that 4.5-year period. So what do we see? For nonverbal communication, basically it's a story of stability. And that over 50% of the adolescents and adults, because they were mixed together in this analysis, were about the same at time 1 as time 4 in nonverbal communication, and about an equal number improved as declined, slightly more improved, but statistically they were balanced out. But for social reciprocity, although there was mostly a profile of stability, there was significantly more improvement during this 4.5-year period than there was decline. The red bar was significantly greater than the yellow bar. So what we're seeing during adolescence and adulthood is improvement in social reciprocity capabilities and behaviors among adolescents and adults with autism. And similarly, quite a dramatic set of indication of improvements in verbal communication. And that 50% of the sample members during this 4.5-year period improved in their verbal communication skills and that was really something. And also a significant improvement in repetitive behaviors, which means a reduction in repetitive behaviors. So we also asked the same set of questions about behavior problems, about maladaptive behaviors. And here we used a measure called the SIBAR, the Scales of Independent Behavior Revised. And it measures internalized behaviors, externalized behaviors, and asocial behaviors. Internalized are behaviors that are like hurtful to yourself or unusual or repetitive habits. Externalized behaviors are hurtful to others, destructive behaviors, disruptive behaviors. And asocial behaviors are socially offensive, uncooperative behaviors. And we asked the same question from time 1 to time 4, what's the change in behavior problems? And here, again, I think there's cause for optimism. Although for each dimension, internalized, externalized, asocial, and a summary total score, there was more stability than anything else, there was very little worsening. And there was, for each of those 4, there was significantly more number of people who improved than who got worse during this 4.5-year period. And the greatest amount of improvement was in the internalized behaviors those are in some ways associated with depression. About 40% of the adults in our sample became less symptomatic in internalized depression during this 4.5-year period. And we were thrilled to see these results. I mean, we were fearful of what the data would tell us when we began our study in terms of the course of symptoms in adolescence and adulthood. So we think this is good news. I have to say, a job not done yet from our research is asking what was going on with those smaller number of people who got worse, and we need to understand that so that we can see what the factors are that are associated with it. But in general, this is a story of stability or gradual improvement in autism symptoms and behavior problems during this 4.5-year period. And this 4.5-year period came in different stages for different people. In other words, some of these were children as young as 10 to 14, and some of these were people as old as 52 to 56. So it was just a 4-year slice of life, and on average, there was this profile of either stability or gradual improvement. And so when you extend that out, I think that this is a cause for some optimism. And of course, we can speculate and investigate what are the causes of this improvement. Clearly, growing up is a big part of it. When we think about any child who's growing up and 4 years later, we hope that the direction is improvement in self-control and interaction with society. So this is clearly true for people with autism spectrum diagnoses as well as any other individual. But a supportive family environment, proper education, and adequate services, I think, are hypotheses about what other factors may be, and I think I showed you data in the beginning of my presentation about the power of the family environment to improve autism symptoms and reduce behavior problems. So then we zeroed in on a subgroup of our study. And here we were just looking at those individuals, that subsample, who were in high school when our study began, and that's 242 of the 406 individuals. And the question here is, what happens when an individual leaves high school to their autism symptoms and behavior problems? And I have to say, going into this analysis, which was led by another former postdoc, Julie Lowndes-Taylor, who's now at Vanderbilt University. And when we began this analysis, my hunch, my hypothesis would have been that leaving high school would be a good thing, because individuals, the difficulties of the high school years that we all know about, the stress and the anxiety, sometimes there's bullying, then there would be an end to that. And the challenges for those with intellectual disabilities in school is something that is really substantial. So our hypothesis was that it would be a turning point to leave high school in the direction that I just mentioned. And we were looking to see whether the people with a diagnosis of intellectual disability, in other words, an IQ of about 70 or below, would have a different post-high school experience than people without intellectual disability. And we expected that those without intellectual disability would have a better post-high school experience. And we also looked at a factor that's often overlooked, which is the family income. And we were interested to know if you were in the lowest income within our largely middle-class sample, would you have a different post-high school experience than those with higher income? So this is what we found, and let me try to describe how to interpret this graph. So a high score shows more symptoms. So the higher the score, the more serious the autism symptoms are. So declining scores, the declining line is a good thing. That's showing the improvement, the reduction of the symptoms. And what you see in the red line is those who have intellectual disability, those with IQs of 70 or below. And the blue line, they are the adults in our study whose IQs were more or less above 70. And so what you see is the vertical line is high school exit. So we reorganized the data so we had the points of time before they left high school and the points of time after they left high school. And that's how this slide is structured. Only somehow my line got moved over. And that vertical line should be at that 0 point. So just imagine if it's that the vertical line is right at 0, which is just a little to the left of where you see it. So what happens is everyone improves during high school. The autism symptoms become less severe. And that's the data I showed you already, was gradual improvement in autism symptoms. People with intellectual disability, at the red line, they have more autism symptoms than people without intellectual disability, and their rate of improvement is a little bit slower. But people without intellectual disability, when they leave high school, that line pivots. The rate of improvement slows down after they leave high school. In other words, they still are improving in their autism symptoms. The autism symptoms are becoming less severe, but the rate of improvement is less after high school exit for those who do not have intellectual disability. I think the rate of improvement for those with intellectual disability continues. And maybe that's because there are services for them after they leave high school. Maybe.